ನಮಸ್ತೆ. ನಾವು ಮೊನ್ನೆ ಕ್ಲಾಸ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಕ್ಲಾಸಸ್ ಮತ್ತು ಆಬ್ಜೆಕ್ಟ್ಸ್ ಇದ್ದು ಕ್ಲಾಸ್ ಹೇಗೆ ಡಿಫೈನ್ ಮಾಡೋದು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ನೋಡಿದ್ದೇವೆ. ಅದನ್ನು ಜಸ್ಟ್ ರಿಕಾಲ್ ಮಾಡುವ. ದಿ ಸಿಂಟ್ಯಾಕ್ಸ್ ಈಸ್ ಕ್ಲಾಸ್, user defined name, open flower bracket, private, colon, member data, member function, public, colon, member data, member function, protected, colon, member data, member function, close the flower bracket here, semicolon. This is the syntax of the class. We have seen the difference between the private and public. Private, whatever member data and member function that we have defined here is private to this class. We cannot access this member data and member function outside the class. Public, whatever member data and member function is defined here can be accessed inside the class as well as outside the class. But when we come to the protected, here also we do have the same member data, member function, but there is a small difference. Protected works something like the private, but apart from that, there are two more concepts. One is that we have seen in the last class, just I am trying to recall it back. Friend functions can access these member data and member functions. What's a friend function? Friend function is a function which is not defined inside the class but can access the member data and member functions. At the same time, there is one more concept which we will come across that later on, that is inheritance, where members derived from this class can access this member data and member functions. That we shall see later on. Now coming to the example, the same example, class account. Here we have taken account number, name, account type and balance in the account. Account number, every account will be having its own account number. Of course, the name of the account holder, account type like SB, FD, RD, etc., etc. Then the balance in the account. These are the variables that we, of course, last year also we had this. But there is a small difference when we come to the object oriented. We shall look into that later. Now coming to get data and display or put data, whatever it is. These are the two functions. Now you will have a doubt here. We have written the function here, but statements are not written to these functions. Of course, we are going to deal with that also because there are two types of functions which could be defined for a class. Then we have closed this and a semicolon. This is the example for a class. The statements for this we can write later, but it shows that there are variables here. At the same time, there are functions here. Now let us try to understand the concept. Last year, suppose you had taken the example of integer. It can be mark 1, mark in the subject 1, mark in the subject 2, mark in the subject 3 and mark in the subject 4. Simple example. It's a procedural language. Even though last year we had C++, the concept of object was not there. This year, whenever we are going to talk about this variable, suppose we are going to define this one, we will write somewhere here. Now here, how it is different in object oriented? Here we are going to define the objects. What are the objects? Objects in a class, we are going to define or declare the objects which are having the similar characteristics. Suppose you take the students of a class PCMC, then they are going to have the subjects physics, chemistry, maths and computer science. Or it may be SC, BA, They are going to have these subjects: statistics, computer science, business studies, and accounts. Instead of Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 3, Mark 4, we are going to define these variables. Now let us see how it is different. See, suppose we take, let me rub this. If you are going to take M1, M2, M3, M4, we do not know whose marks these are. In case of the class and objects, we are going to define the object. We are going to define the object. For example, student 1 is the object. Now, when we talk about M1, M2, M3, and M4, student 1 or the name of the student, let it be Aman. So M1 is the mark of the Aman. Mark M2 is the mark of the Aman. M3 is also the mark of the Aman in one more subject. M4 is also the mark of the Aman in subject 4 or mark 4. But in the previous last year, whatever examples we have taken, in that we do not take this particular concept, that is the object. So here let it be O. So when we take the object, it will be O dot M1. In place of Aman, I have taken the object as O. Similarly, O dot M2, O dot M3, O dot M4. That's why we say that these are the characteristics. Then, when we talk about the functions, what it will do? It will define some behavior or the work it has to be done, which has to be done. That's why the concept itself will be somewhat different. Now we shall see which are the different types of functions. There are two types of functions. Inside the class definition, second one outside the class definition. Let us take the first one, that is inside the class definition. How it is here. See, here we shall define a class name or user defined name, defined name. Then we will write the private. We will define the member functions or member data. Then we will write the public. Then we are going to declare the function, that is return type, function name, Then what we have seen in the syntax is we have written, or it can be function name or member function, and we have written semicolon here. But in case of inside the class definition, what we will do is we are not going to just declare, we are going to define it here itself. So we will write the function, we will open the flower bracket, we will write the statements here, then we will close it. We shall see one example. Suppose we are going to declare a class rectangle let's declare private int length and breadth. Only two variables here. Then we shall declare the function public. We shall have two functions. One function is to display the value of length and breadth. One more function to one function to input the value of length and breadth. One more function to display the value of length and breadth. We are not going to calculate anything here. Let us keep it very simple. So here public void input open the flower bracket, because we are going to input the value here itself. Inside the class itself we are going to define the function. So cout enter length and breadth. Then cin, that is length greater than breadth, and close this. That is one function. One more function we shall write here. Void display cout length is equal to length. End of line we can write cout breadth is equal to breadth. Close this. We have written two functions. One function here, that is to input the values, and second function, that is to display the values. Now we shall close the class. Of course, only class part we have done. We have not defined the object for the class here. Object for the class will be declared using the void main, that we shall see later. So one more thing, keep it in mind. Usually whenever we are going to declare the variables will be declared under private and the functions will be declared under public. Suppose we forgot to write the private, then what will happen? By default, even if you don't declare any variables using private, by default it will consider it as private. But the functions we need to declare under public, because if you don't declare under public, by default even these functions will be taken as private, and outside the class we can't access these values. So we will get error message. Moving on to the second type, that is functions written outside the class. The same example we shall modify how the functions can be written outside the class. Outside the class. how it is different from the functions written inside the class. Here, whenever we are going to write a function, what will be the syntax of the function? Let's write the syntax of the function only. Later we shall go to the example. So in this case, anyhow we are going to write the class here. Let's write the entire structure once. Class name or user defined name, class name. Let me write class name for the time being. Here we will write private and we will declare some of the variables here. Then we will write public and we will declare the function here, like return type, function name, then arguments here, type argument 1, comma type argument 2, etc., type argument n we can write, or we can write argument list. We will have this semicolon here. Try to note the difference. In the previous one, we have written return type, function name, then the statements there itself we have written. There was no semicolon in that case, but here there is semicolon. Any number of functions we can have here. In that case, return type, function name 1, argument list, return type, function name 2, argument list, semicolon, etc., we have to write. Then we shall close it here. And we are going to close the class. Once again, note the difference. Here, return type, function name, argument list, semicolon. In the previous case, we had return type, function name. It can have the argument list, but usually whenever we are writing the function inside the class, this part will be empty, most of the cases. Now, once we have written this much, this function has to have the statements inside it. Then where we are going to write this function? Of course, this function is there. Even the statements are there inside this function. But those statements will be written outside the class. How it will be? Let's write it here. A return type, class name, scope resolution operator, that is two columns together, then the function name, then argument list. Then open the bracket, write the statements here. Executable statements here, then close the function. So what is the difference in this case? A return type, some of the cases it may be void also. Then the class name, which class name? The class name to which this particular function belongs to. So this function is this one. So this function is there inside this class. If the name of the class is x here, for example, here we need to write x in place of the class name, because we are writing this function outside this class. So when we are coming across that particular function, we should know this function belongs to which particular class. So that class name is important here. After class name, scope resolution operator. So immediately after class name, we will have scope resolution. This is called as scope resolution operator. Scope resolution operator, then the function name, the same name we have to write. Usually whenever we are writing the function inside the class, this is called as declaration of the function, and this is called as definition of the function. When we have the function inside the class, we are going to define the function there itself, But here in this case we are going to declare the function inside the class and we are going to define the function outside the class. Hope the difference between the declaration and definition is understood. When we are going to write the statements for the function, it's called as definition. If you are going to just declare a function here, it is called as declaration. Declaration in the sense, we are going to declare that this function belongs to this particular class. But we are not going to write the actual statements. We are going to write the actual statements outside that, outside the class. And just now we have seen two types of functions. One is function inside the class, the other one is function outside the class. Whenever the function is a very small, very simple function, in those cases we are going to write the function inside the class. If the function is somewhat lengthy or complicated, or if the function is having some loops like for statement, while or do while, or the function is somewhat complicated, then we are going to write the function outside the class. We shall modify the same program, that is the rectangle. Just now we have seen a class named rectangle where we have inputted the length and breadth. The same function we shall write for this particular, that is for the function outside the class. Remember, still we have not defined the objects. Objects will be defined inside the void main. Class rectangle usually the functions will be written under public and the variables, that is member data, will be written under private. Suppose we have not written the private, then what happens? By default those variables will be considered as private. Private int length and breadth. Under public we shall declare two functions, void input or get data. Then semicolon, because we are just declaring the functions here, we are going to write the statements outside the class. Void display. Then close the class. Semicolon. We shall write the function get data now. So how it will be? Return type, that is void. Let me write the syntax. Return type, class name, scope resolution operator, function name, then the arguments. So here return type, that is void. Then comes the class name. What is the class name? Class name is the rectangle. So we need to write rectangle here. Then comes the scope resolution operator. Write it as it is. Then the function name. What is the function name? Function name is get data. Then arguments. We don't have any arguments here. Open the flower bucket. Write the statements. Statements, cout, enter, length and breadth. Scene, length, breadth. Close it. This is the first function, that is get data. Similarly, let us write the second function. Here also follow the syntax. Return type, return type is void, function name is display, class name is rectangle. So return type void, that is this one. Then class name is rectangle, then scope resolution operator, colon, one more colon, then the function name display, then the brackets. Remember, there is no semicolon here. Semicolon will be written only when we are going to declare the functions, and here we are going to define the function, so there is no semicolon. Just display the value. Cout length is equal to length, end of line, semicolon, cout breadth write the variable, semicolon, close it. So we have written both the function outside the class. Now we have a question, can't we write one of the function inside, the second function outside the class? Of course we can do that. One of the function could be written inside and the other function could be written outside, or both the functions inside and both the functions outside. It depends. As we have just discussed now, if the function is having a loop, then we will write it outside the class. So how a class is defined and how a function is written, we have seen. Now the next part is how to define an object. Defining the object. The syntax of the class we know, class name or user defined name, then private, public, etc. we will write. Private we will write, some statements we will write here, that is declaring the variables. Public we will write, either we will declare the variables inside the class, define the we will define the function inside the class, or we will write the functions outside the class, then we will close the class. Then how to define the object, that is the main purpose. Without declaring the class here or defining the class here, we can't declare the object for the class. Then inside the void main we will write user defined name, that is the class name itself, the same name we need to write. Then the object 1, or we can write object name. If you are going to declare only one object, we will write it as object name, or we can have many objects. So in that case we can write object name 1, comma object name 2, etc. Object name n. We shall have a simple program how to define the object for a class. Or we shall take one that is to calculate simple interest. Let us write the header files first. Hash include iostream.h. Only one header file let us have for the time being. Then class interests, which are the variables that we need. One is principal, then time, then rate of interest R. What we are going to calculate? We are going to calculate simple interest. So 4 variables we need, out of which 3 are the inputs, that is P, T and R. SI we are going to calculate. We are going to have 3 functions, which are those: one for input, one for calculate the simple interest, and one more function to display. One by one we shall write. So first part, we shall declare the variables. Which are the variables? Let us declare the variables under private. Under private, let us take those variables as float. Which are the variables? Principal, time, rate of interest, and the value that we need to calculate is SI. Semicolon. Then under public, we are going to have 3 functions. One is input, second one is compute, third one is display. We shall write the function. Since it is very simple, all these 3 functions are very simple, we can write the function inside the class itself. So void input. What we need to do here, we have to input the values. Which values we need to input? Principal, time and rate. So cout enter principal, time and rate. So what we need to write here? Cin. Which variables? P, T and R. Let us close that. Let me continue here. We have opened the class here. We have declared the variables. Then under public, first function we have written. Let us write the second one, that is compute. But return type is void compute. Then what we need to compute here, that is SI. So SI is equal to, we know the calculation, P into T into R divided by 100. Close the function. Only one statement, because we need to know the value of SI. Finally, the last one, void display. Which are the values that we can display? 4 values. Cout principal is equal to, what we can write? P, then end of line, cout, time, what's that? T, end of line, cout, rate of interest, that is R, end of line, and last one Cout, simple interest is equal to SI. Close this function. 3 functions we have written. Now let us see, we have opened the class here, we have declared the variables here. After that, under public we have defined the functions. Let us close that now. So here we are going to close the class. So class part we have written, variables are declared as well as the functions are defined. We can define these functions outside the class also, that we shall see in the next part. But we have not defined the object. How to define the object now? Object can be defined like this. What is the syntax of defining the object? Class name, space, object name, and semicolon. If you are going to declare only one object, it will be class name or user defined name, then object name. Object name. Keeping that in our mind, let us declare the object for this, but we are going to declare the objects inside the void main. So we shall write void main. First task is to create the object. So here, what is the class name? Class name is interest. Interest space object name. So you can write object, or we shall write name for a object. Let us keep it simple, I. Now what happened? We have created the object I, but for what? For which class? We have created the object I for the class interest. As soon as you write this much, immediately an object for the class interest will be created. Remember, in interest what we have? P, T, R, as well as we have SI. Similarly, 3 functions, that is input, compute, and display. Without creating an object, we can't do anything here. That's why first we are going to create an object. Once we have created the object, then only with the help of the object we can call the functions. As soon as we write this much, immediately the object I is created here. Let's think that this is I. This class, what it does it have? It has the variables P, T, R, and SI. Immediately this object I will be having the spaces for P, T, R, and SI. Of course, only the reservation in the memory will be done. The values are not inputted, values will be inputted later, and here this will be calculated later. But for the time being, as soon as we create the object I for the class interest, it will reserve the space for these variables. Once it's done, then we have to call those functions. Let's see the example now, and we shall discuss that later on. Once we declare the object I, now we need to call the functions. How to call the functions? Here, whenever we are calling the function, functions cannot be called directly. The function has to be called with the help of an object. We have to input the value, we have to compute the value, and we have to display the value. Which are the values that we need to input? P, T, R. So we can't directly call the function input. So we have to call the function input with the help of the object. So we have to write I dot input. As soon as we write I dot input, the control will be transferred to the function input. Control will be transferred to the function input, where we are going to input the value for P, T, and R. Earlier we had created the object I, where we had P, T, and R, as well as I, SI. Whatever values are inputted to P, T, and R will be stored here. Let it be 1000, time is 2 years, and rate of interest is 5. If you have inputted these values, that will be stored. Then once it is done, then we have to call the function compute. Again, it has to be called with the help of object I dot compute. Once the value will be computed, we will get the answer here, and whatever answer we got will be stored here. Then once after that, we need to display the values. Again, the function has to be called with the help of the object I dot display, here also the semicolon, then close it, close the void main. This is how a program will get executed in C++. Okay, thank you.